The sky over Normandy was a trembling grey that morning, streaked with the smoke of burning fuel and the white bursts of German flak. A Republic P-47D Thunderbolt roared low over a twisting convoy of trucks and armoured vehicles, its 8 Browning machine guns already chewing through belts of ammunition. The German soldiers below scattered across the fields, their shouts drowned out by the unrelenting growl of the radial engine. For the men of the Wehrmacht, this was another American attack run fast, brutal, and confident. But for one Thunderbolt pilot that morning, confidence had just run out. From a camouflaged gun pit near the road, a German 88mm anti-aircraft gun spat fire. Its shells arced into the sky, black puffs walking toward the diving fighter. The fourth burst hit home. The P-47 shuddered as shrapnel tore through its belly. 2 more hits followed in quick succession from the left, 20mm cannon shells from an Focke-Wulf closing fast. The engine took the worst of it, several cylinders blown out of the Great Pratt and Whitney R2800, radial, coolant and oil, spraying like blood. A plume of black smoke trailed behind as the pilot wrestled with the stick. The Thunderbolt should have disintegrated. Any other fighter, certainly a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire, would have broken apart under that kind of punishment. Yet this one stayed together. The pilot's face was slick with sweat and oil, his gloved hands trembling on the throttle. Instruments were dying, dials spinning uselessly, but the control surfaces still answered, stiffly but faithfully. He held altitude just long enough to clear the line of trees at the edge of a field. Then he cut the mixture, lowered the nose, and let the massive fighter slide toward the ground. The crash landing was not elegant. The Thunderbolt's belly tore a furrow through a beet field, dirt and roots exploding in every direction. When it finally stopped, propeller was twisted and motionless, the right wing nearly sheared away. One main gear leg crumpled. Steam and smoke hissed from the engine. German infantrymen from a nearby position were the first to reach it. They expected to find a corpse, an American reduced to ash inside his own machine. Instead, they found a man alive, burned and bloodied, but still conscious. He was trying, in a kind of dazed fury, to pull the ammunition feed away from the wing root before the heat could set it off. He cursed at them when they dragged him out. The soldiers stared at him, astonished that he was breathing at all. "Ein Schwein," one of them muttered, half in disbelief, half in admiration. A pig, a stubborn, indestructible animal that refused to die. Within an hour, the Luftwaffe's local Feldluftpark, the forward maintenance and recovery detachment responsible for collecting downed aircraft, received word. An American Thunderbolt had force-landed intact. Orders were clear and had been for months capture Allied aircraft whenever possible. Even damaged wrecks were worth studying. Anything that could reveal the enemy's strengths, their materials, their secrets. By late afternoon, a small convoy of Luftwaffe mechanics and officers arrived. Their first reaction was laughter. They had heard about the Thunderbolt, of course the flying barn door, the air tank. Now, standing beside its bulk, they saw what their comrades meant. The plane looked grotesque, swollen, absurdly heavy. One man walked its length, shaking his head. "It is no wonder they need so much fuel," he said. The thing could be a tractor. They made jokes as they circled it, tapping the thick metal skin with their boots. "Too heavy to maneuver," another said. "Schwerfällig, unmanövrierfähig, schwanger wie eine Kuh, moves like a pregnant cow." The words came easily, the same that filled their after-action reports from the previous year. A machine for a nation that built, everything too big, its cars, its cities, its dreams. But the laughter did not last. One of the mechanics climbed onto the wing to peer into the cockpit. What he saw stopped him cold. The canopy was spiderwebbed with cracks, its surface glittering under the dull light. Around the pilot's headrest, the armor plate bore bright silver pocks, impacts from cannon shells that had failed to penetrate. The armored windscreen itself was scarred where 20mm fragments had struck and detonated harmlessly. He ran his fingers across one crater, feeling where the glass had barely warped. "Unmöglich," he whispered. "Impossible." The fuselage skin along the right side was shredded, curling outward where fragments had ripped through. Yet the underlying frame was intact, rivets held fast. Control cables still ran through their guides. Oil and hydraulic fluid had painted everything black, but the core of the machine remained whole. They had seen Messerschmitts come apart mid-air from less damage, snapping clean through at the tail under stress. This monster had stayed in one piece long enough for its pilot to pick a field and land it. Fuel leaked steadily from punctured tanks, dripping into the soil. The Germans stepped back, wary of fire. Even now, the smell of high-octane gasoline filled the air, thick and sweet. The landing gear, though torn and twisted, had somehow absorbed the shock of impact without collapsing completely. "Look at this," one of the pilots said, crouching beside the wreck. He skidded it in on its belly, and the frame did not crack. The wings are like steel. By dusk, the Thunderbolt had been towed under the half-collapsed roof of a nearby barn. Blackout curtains were drawn tight. Lanterns glowed dimly, their light catching on the American insignia still faintly visible beneath layers of mud. Two experienced Luftwaffe pilots stood beneath the enormous wing, silent. Their faces were grey with fatigue and something like awe. The jokes were gone. They were not looking at a clumsy enemy toy anymore. They were staring at a problem, at proof that the Americans built airplanes by a logic they had not fully understood. The senior officer finally spoke. "They build it as if they expect to be hit," he said quietly, "as if they assume they will be hit and still must return." The others nodded, uneasy. This was not how the Luftwaffe built fighters. German design prized agility, elegance, and the pilot's skill to avoid being struck at all. The idea of armoring a fighter like a tank was foreign, almost obscene. Outside, the captured pilot lay on a stretcher under guard. His burns were bandaged, his flight suit half charred. When questioned, he said little, only that he had been flying cover for a strafing mission, and that the Thunderbolt could take more punishment than anyone believed. One of the guards later wrote in his diary that night, "The American looked at the wreck as if he loved it. I think he believed it had saved him." History would record that the Germans recovered several Thunderbolts intact during the spring of 1943 and 1944, transporting them to test centers like Rechlin for evaluation. But this moment, in the quiet barn near Cratered, was something else entirely. It was the instant when rumor turned to evidence. When men who had mocked the air tank touched its metal and understood why their own comrades' shells had failed to bring it down. As the blackout lamps flickered and the smell of scorched oil filled the air, one of the mechanics leaned close to the torn fuselage and whispered, half to himself, "If they can build thousands of these, how do we win?" No one answered him. The question hung in the dark like the scent of gasoline, heavy, undeniable, and full of foreboding. The captured Thunderbolt arrived at Rechlin 3 days after its forced landing, lashed to the bed of a flatbed trailer like a wounded animal. Its wings had been removed for transport, the fuselage wrapped in tarpaulin that did little to hide its monstrous shape. The convoy passed through small German towns, where civilians stopped and stared. Even in defeat, the aircraft looked imposing, broad-shouldered, swollen with strength, the kind of machine that seemed to sneer at fragility itself. Soldiers riding atop the truck joked that the Americans must have built it from cast iron. At Rechlin, the heart of the Luftwaffe's Technical Evaluation Division, captured enemy aircraft were taken apart like puzzles. The engineers here were professionals, not line pilots. They had seen Spitfires, Mustangs, even a B-25 bomber in pieces. Yet when the P-47D was rolled into hangar number 7, the atmosphere shifted. The machine's scale defied everything they associated with fighter design. Hauptmann Otto Berthold, a veteran test pilot with scars from years of frontline flying, was among the first to inspect it. He walked a slow circle around the stripped fuselage, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "It's not an airplane," he muttered. "It's an engine with wings." And in a sense, he was right. The enormous Pratt & Whitney radial engine dominated the entire front half of the aircraft, its cylinders blackened and battered from the Normandy flak burst. When technicians opened the cowling, They found holes clean through the cooling fins, yet the crankshaft had not seized. The engine had kept turning even as oil poured from shattered lines. A junior engineer whistled softly as he studied the damage. "Our Daimler-Benz engines would have stopped the moment the coolant was lost," he said. "Liquid cooling one hole and it's finished." He tapped the thick metal casing of the American engine. "But this beast keeps running with half its guts missing." They stripped the cockpit next, noting the layout simple, functional, brutally practical. No polished wooden panels or delicate levers. Everything was steel, painted black and grey, built to last. The pilot's seat armor weighed nearly 200 kilograms. Behind it, another plate protected the control cables. "They armored the pilot like a tank driver," Berthold said. "We fly glass eggs. He flies a fortress." The armor-glass windscreen, when measured, was found to be nearly 2 centimeters thick. The test team recorded the results and sent them to Berlin with a note. "Allied fighter protection surpasses current Luftwaffe standard. Recommend increased armor on Focke-Wulf series if weight permits." But even as they wrote the recommendation, they knew it was impossible. Germany no longer had the aluminum, the fuel, or the time to build such extravagance. When they examined the ammunition feed system, the Germans were astonished again. Each of the 8 Browning machine guns had an independent electrical feed with powered booster motors to prevent jamming during high-G maneuvers. The ammunition belt's 340 rounds per gun ran in carefully machined channels lined with smooth metal guides. "It could fire upside down, in a dive, or in a spin," an engineer said. "The feed is foolproof," Berthold grunted. "No wonder they fire so long. Our MG-151 jams if you look at it wrong." That afternoon, mechanics reattached the wings for static tests. The span seemed immense, even in the cavernous hangar. The spars were solid, thick as a man's wrist, and braced with steel fittings that looked more like something from a bomber. When a crane lifted the fuselage by one wingtip for stress testing, the structure barely flexed. 40,000 pounds. An engineer calculated aloud. The wing spars could hold 3 times the plane's own weight, overbuilt to madness. Yet that madness had saved the pilot's life. When the engineers finished cataloguing the damage, they invited several Jagdgeschwader pilots from frontline units to observe. The visitors arrived still, skeptical, men who had flown the elegant Focke-Wulf and the agile Messerschmitt for years. They walked around the repaired Thunderbolt, muttering about its size. But their tone changed as the Rechlin engineers showed them the evidence photos of the Normandy crash site, the shattered engine that had still run, the intact cockpit glass. One pilot leaned close to the bullet-pocked fuselage and whispered, "It looks like it was built to be shot." "Exactly," said Berthold. "They expect to lose aircraft, but they don't expect to lose pilots. The machine lives long enough to bring the man home. Then they build another one tomorrow." The room fell silent. It was an uncomfortable truth. German pilots fought as if they were irreplaceable, because they were. Their machines were delicate, hand-tuned instruments requiring weeks of work and scarce materials. The Americans built theirs like farm equipment, ugly, crude, but endless in number. When the Thunderbolt's engine was finally coaxed back to life under power from an auxiliary starter, the entire hangar trembled. The deep growl of the double Wasp filled the air, louder than any German engine, a living thing of pistons and fury. The mechanics stepped back instinctively. Oil smoke poured from the exhausts, and for a moment everyone felt the strange illusion that the captured beast was angry at being caged. Berthold climbed the ladder to the cockpit and looked through the cracked windscreen. He imagined flying it its weight, its strength, its brute refusal to die. He had spent years mastering machines that demanded finesse, perfect touch, elegant control. This one demanded something different: willpower, endurance, and faith in its armor. It was not beautiful, but it was honest. That night, in the officers' mess, the conversation turned somber. One young pilot raised his glass and said, "We will shoot it down again if we meet it in the air." Berthold only smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But remember, when you shoot at it, you are shooting at America itself. All their factories, all their oil, all their men. This, he gestured toward the test hangar beyond the window, is what it looks like when a nation builds for a war it knows it will win. Outside, the captured P-47 sat beneath its blackout tarpaulin, the engine cooling, the metal ticking as it shed heat into the night. It was silent now, but to those who had heard it roar, that silence felt temporary, like the pause before thunder. By the summer of 1944, the name Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity to German pilots, it was a problem. Luftwaffe squadrons, stationed from Normandy to the Rhine, began filling their reports with the same phrase, unmöglich zu zerstören, impossible to destroy. The stories sounded exaggerated at first. American fighters that came home with engines shot apart, wings perforated, tails half gone, but the evidence, mounting with every mission, was undeniable. In late June, just weeks after D-Day, Oberleutnant Franz Keller of Jagdgeschwader 26 saw it with his own eyes. He had dived from 20,000 feet onto a pair of P-47s strafing a German convoy south of Caen. His Focke-Wulf roared into firing position, and his 20mm cannon stitched a burst across the lead aircraft. He saw pieces fly from its fuselage, white smoke trailing. The Thunderbolt should have exploded. Instead, it steadied itself, rolled right, and climbed. Keller stayed on its tail, firing again until both his wing guns clicked empty. The American simply kept flying. "I hit him 10 times, Keller wrote in his combat log that night. Any other aircraft would have fallen apart. The Thunderbolt seemed to absorb the shells and fly faster. He would later tell Allied interrogators, after the war, that the encounter changed him. "I realized then," he said, "that I was not fighting pilots anymore. I was fighting machines that could not be killed." For the Americans, those very qualities had become the stuff of legend. At forward airfields in England, pilots of the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups traded stories of miraculous survivals. They told of Robert Johnson, who in June of the previous year had flown his P-47 home with more than 200 holes in it, after an Fu-190 emptied its guns into his tail. His canopy was jammed, his controls half frozen, and he had nearly bled to death. Yet the Thunderbolt brought him back. That story spread like gospel through both air forces. German intelligence officers at Rechlin read it in Allied newspapers smuggled through neutral channels. "Propaganda," one officer scoffed at first. But then they stood under the wings of the wreck recovered from Creteville and saw the truth written in torn metal. Not propaganda, but proof. In July, Rechlin engineers conducted live-fire tests on the salvaged cockpit section. They mounted the wrecked fuselage on a wooden stand and brought up a captured MG-131 machine gun and an MG-151 cannon. At 100 meters, they opened fire. The small-caliber rounds left bright dents on the armor behind the pilot's seat. The cannon shells gouged the metal, but failed to punch through. The test officer's report, signed in neat Gothic script, concluded, "The American fighter affords its pilot an exceptional probability of survival from the rear hemisphere. Comparable protection in German designs is absent." That phrase, exceptional probability of survival, troubled the men who read it. Survival was not supposed to be part of fighter design. In the Luftwaffe, pilots were expected to win by not being hit at all. The idea of engineering a machine to be struck repeatedly and still return was alien, almost obscene. But now, the frontline reports matched the test data. The Thunderbolt was not a fluke of overbuilding, it was doctrine-made metal. By August, those who fought against it began to call it der Panzerjäger der Lüfte, the tank of the air. German gunners learned that ordinary small-arms fire barely scratched it. Even 20mm flak guns often only wounded. The aircraft's radial engine, without fragile coolant lines, shrugged off hits that would have crippled a Messerschmitt's inline motor. A single bullet through a radiator meant death for a German pilot. The American could take 10 through his cylinders and keep flying home on raw horsepower. Captured reports from 13 Fighter Command later confirmed what the Germans suspected. In many cases, Thunderbolts returned to base missing pieces of wing or elevator, landing gear half deployed, oil pressure gone, but the pilot alive. "It can take punishment no fighter should survive," one ground crew chief wrote. "We patch them, change the engine, and send them back out the next day." The Luftwaffe pilots understood what that meant. Every American who survived brought his experience back to the next mission. Each flight made him better, tougher, harder to kill. German pilots, by contrast, were dying faster than they could be replaced. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its early self young boys, with 50 flying hours facing Americans with hundreds. The Thunderbolt did not just protect lives, it multiplied skill. One night that August, in a field mess outside Paris, a group of German officers drank in silence. They had seen the Rechlin test photos shell impacts stopped by armor, wings that bent without breaking. One man finally said, "If this is what they give to every pilot, what else can they give their army?" Another answered, "They give them everything. They give them factories, fuel, even sugar in their coffee. We give ours excuses." The Thunderbolt became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the industrial democracy that built it. Each rivet, each plate of armor, each massive spar said the same thing. America could afford to keep its men alive. Germany could not. By September, as the Allies broke out of Normandy, Thunderbolts hunted across northern France, almost unchallenged. German convoys dreaded the thunderous growl overhead, the deep, unmistakable rumble of the double Wasp engine. Tank crews dove for cover, screaming, "Jabbo! Jabbo!" as P-47s descended like hawks, their 8 machine guns spitting lines of fire that turned trucks and armored cars into erupting torches. To the men below, it seemed the aircraft could not be killed. They watched through clouds of smoke as bullets sparked harmlessly against its belly. The sound alone became a weapon, rolling thunder, echoing across valleys, even after the fighter was gone. Soldiers spoke of it with superstition. The one that hums low will live. The one that howls will kill you. But to the German pilots still flying, the true horror was professional. They had once believed in individual mastery, that a skilled pilot could outfly any machine. The Thunderbolt ended that illusion. Its sheer durability erased the old rules. You could dive on it, fire until your guns were empty, and it might still outclimb you, trailing smoke like a wounded animal that refused to fall. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe's reports no longer mocked the American pig. They described it with weary respect. One colonel, submitting a report from JG3, wrote, "The Republic fighter is an indestructible opponent. Its construction favors pilot preservation over all else. Such methods, if applied universally, render defeat inevitable to any force that cannot replace its own losses." He was right. The Thunderbolt was not graceful. It was not beautiful. But it was the future, and every German pilot who saw it understood that the future was already in the sky above them. By the autumn of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp edge of the Reich's ambition, was bleeding to death above its own cities. Bombers streamed across the daytime sky in endless silver waves, and behind them came the escorts, thousands of fighters that looked, to the German ground crews below, like a storm of metal birds. Among them, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had become a constant, unmistakable presence, broad-winged, rumbling, merciless. At Rechlin, the test center that had once been a place of pride, the mood was grim. Reports from the front poured in, each repeating the same phrase, unzerstörbar, indestructible. The engineers had done their tests, their calculations, their dissections of the captured airframe. There was nothing more to learn, only to accept what it meant. Oberstleutnant Erich Meinhardt, the senior engineer overseeing foreign aircraft evaluation, stood beside the half-dismantled Thunderbolt in Hangar 7. It had been there for months, its wounds patched, its propeller replaced. The Luftwaffe had even flown it twice under test conditions. It had performed exactly as expected, slow to climb, clumsy to turn, but utterly reliable. It refused to break. "We can build beautiful machines," Meinhardt said to his aide one morning, running his hand along the dull aluminum skin. But they build machines that survive ugly wars. The aide, a young engineer barely out of school, looked up from his clipboard. Should we continue testing, Herr Oberstleutnant? Meinhardt shook his head. No. There is no mystery left in it. The mystery is not here, he said, tapping the fuselage. It is across the ocean in the factories that can make 10,000 more like this without blinking. That realization weighed heavier than any technical report. In the air, Thunderbolts prowled across the continent. With the arrival of drop tanks and new propeller blades, their range and climb had improved. They escorted bombers over the Ruhr and Cologne, and when there were no bombers to guard, they became placed predators, hunting locomotives, convoys, even infantry columns retreating through the mist. To the German soldiers on the ground, the name Thunderbolt became synonymous with doom. Veterans who had fought in Russia swore that not even the Red Air Force's Ilyushin struck with such ferocity. The P-47 came screaming down at impossible speed, the roar of its propeller tips breaking into the edge of supersonic. The first bullets arrived before the sound did, tearing through men, vehicles, and armor alike. Then came the rockets, the 5-inch HVARs that burned through tank turrets as if made of paper. One Wehrmacht corporal, later captured in the Ardennes, described it to his interrogators. "We called them the hammer of the sky," he said. "You could see them coming and still not move fast enough. Bullets rained like gravel on a tin roof. You hid, and you prayed the next pass wasn't for you." In October, at Rechlin, the test pilots were ordered to compare the Thunderbolt with their latest Focke-Wulf variant, the A9. On paper, the German fighter still held an edge in agility. In practice, the results were humiliating. During mock engagements, the Thunderbolt's dive and roll performance allowed it to escape every simulated attack. Its acceleration in a dive was unmatched. Its controls remained solid when the German aircrafts began to stiffen from compressibility. Hauptmann Otto Berthold, who had once mocked the American design, returned from the flight pale and thoughtful. "It is not a pilot's airplane," he told the staff, gathered in the hangar. "It is an engineer's airplane. It forgives mistakes. It carries its pilot home." He looked toward the cracked canopy of the captured Thunderbolt. If we had this philosophy in 1940, we might not be standing here now. By November, the front was collapsing. Allied bombers came every day. The once proud test fields at Rechlin were cratered by air raids. The captured P-47, too damaged to fly again, was pushed into a corner of the hangar under a tarpaulin, half forgotten. When the bombs fell, mechanics sometimes used it as shelter. They joked grimly that it was the safest place on the base. More than once, after an air raid, they pulled the tarp back and found it untouched amid twisted wreckage, a slab of American defiance that refused to burn. In those final months, Meinhardt wrote one last entry in his report to Berlin. "The Thunderbolt is the material expression of a doctrine we cannot match. It is built not for grace but for victory, not for the pilot's ego but for his survival. The lesson is clear. Though it comes too late, the future belongs to those who can afford to lose everything except their pilots." Outside, the snow began to fall over the ruined runways. The sound of Allied engines rolled faintly in the distance, low, relentless, and certain. To the men who had once laughed at the American pig, that sound was no longer comic, it was prophecy. The first morning of the new year dawned over Belgium in silence, cold, grey, and deceptive. Beneath that stillness, the Luftwaffe prepared its final great gamble. Unternehmen Bodenplatte, Operation Baseplate, a desperate strike meant to sweep Allied air power from the skies by destroying their aircraft on the ground. Nearly 900 German fighters waited on frost-covered airstrips from the Ardennes to the Rhine, their tanks filled with precious, dwindling fuel. It was to be the Luftwaffe's thunderclap of revenge. At dawn, they took off into the freezing mist, low and fast, hugging the ground to evade radar. Among their targets was Street. Trond Advanced Landing Ground Y-29, home to the 366th Fighter Group of the 9th Air Force, flying Republic P-47s. It was here, on this frigid field of pierced steel planking and mud, that the myth of the indestructible Thunderbolt would meet its final, undeniable proof. Major George Brooking was finishing a cup of coffee in the mess tent when the first explosions hit. The roar of engines followed dozens of them. Someone shouted, "Bandits! Take cover!" Outside, fireballs rose where parked aircraft burned, the air thick with cordite and panic. Brooking ran for his plane, a P-47D-40, newly flown in from England only days earlier. Around him, ground crews scattered like ants, some diving into slit trenches, others hauling ammunition boxes to the surviving aircraft. The German formation fighters from Jagdgeschwader 11 and 2 swept low across the airfield, cannons hammering, tracers streaking through the morning haze. The first pass destroyed 20 Thunderbolts, fuel trucks, and several buildings. For a moment, it seemed the Luftwaffe had achieved its impossible dream. Then the Americans began to fight back. Brooking's Thunderbolt, engines coughing from the cold, lurched down the runway through a storm of bullets. His wingman, Lieutenant Red Morgan, followed close behind. The instant their wheels left the ground, both men rolled hard to avoid cannon fire and pulled into the climbing turn that had become instinct for Thunderbolt pilots, a move that traded agility for speed and mass. Above the airfield, the sky erupted into chaos. German pilots had been briefed that morning to expect defenseless aircraft. Instead, they found the American pigs, charging straight at them with their 8 heavy guns blazing. The 50 caliber Brownings, harmonized at 300 yards, filled the sky with incandescent fire. A Fokker Wolf ahead of Brooking disintegrated in one burst, its wings shearing away, its fuselage a tumbling torch. The Luftwaffe's last gamble met the hard reality of the Republic's machine. Though the airfield was a furnace, fuel tanks burning, ammunition cooking off the Thunderbolts kept taking off. Some rolled through flames to reach speed, others launched with half their control, surfaces shredded. Once airborne, they were uncatchable in a dive. Their armor shrugged off the cannon hits that would have gutted a lighter fighter. Within 20 minutes, the battle above Street Trond turned. The German advantage of surprise evaporated beneath streams of 50 caliber fire. 4 Thunderbolts fell, but more than 24 enemy aircraft were destroyed. When the smoke cleared, twisted wrecks of Fu-190s and Bf-109s littered the frozen fields. One German pilot, a lieutenant from Jagdgeschwader 2, captured that afternoon, stood in shock as he watched replacement aircraft already arriving. "You lost 20, he said through an interpreter. "We burned them." Brooking, still smeared with oil and soot, pointed to the new arrivals taxiing in. "We'll have 40 by morning," he said. "How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The prisoner said nothing. Operation Baseplate was supposed to cripple the Allied air forces. Instead, it broke the Luftwaffe's back. The Germans lost 270 aircraft and more than 200 trained pilots in one morning, men they could never replace. The Americans replaced every destroyed Thunderbolt within days. That night, in the wreckage of Street Tron's operations hut, an intelligence officer recorded the day's events. His report closed with a simple line: "The P-47 continues to demonstrate an extraordinary capacity to endure combat damage and maintain operational capability under extreme conditions." For the Luftwaffe survivors retreating eastward, the lesson was burned into memory. They had mocked the Thunderbolt as the American pig. Now, they whispered another name: Donnerschlag the Thunderclap. In the weeks that followed, the skies of Western Europe filled once more with the sound of the big radial engines. Thunderbolts struck rail lines, convoys, bridges, each pass a hammer blow. The Luftwaffe, its fuel gone and its veterans dead, could no longer rise to meet them. From Recklin's empty hangars to the frozen fields of Belgium, the verdict was final. The P-47 had outlasted the Reich itself. It had arrived as a subject of ridicule and left as the embodiment of inevitability, America's thunder rolling eastward, one indestructible machine at a time. By February of 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force, it was a memory. Its airfields lay cratered and frozen, its hangars burned out shells, its fuel depots empty. The skies that once echoed with the song of Daimler-Benz and BMW engines now belonged entirely to the deep, hammering thunder of American power. And above the shattered cities of Germany, the most familiar of those sounds was not the whine of a Mustang or the growl of a Spitfire. It was the low, rolling rumble of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Every German soldier, from the Rhine to the Oder, learned to recognize that noise. It began as a faint vibration, a tremor that rattled glass and teeth, growing into a physical presence that seemed to crawl through the bones. Civilians whispered that it meant the Donnerschlag was coming, the thunderclap. By then, no one laughed at the old jokes about the American pig. The pigs had become predators, descending from the grey winter sky in endless flocks. At a half-ruined airfield outside Bonn, the remains of Jagdgeschwader 26 waited for orders that never came. Their surviving aircraft, 4 Fokker-Wulfs and a single Bf 109, sat in snowdrifts, engines silent, fuel tanks dry. The men huddled in the wreckage of a mess hut, the air thick with cigarette smoke and quiet bitterness. Someone had pinned a torn photograph of a Thunderbolt to the wall, taken from an Allied leaflet. Beneath it, in charcoal, a mechanic had written, "Unzerstörbar, wir sind es nicht, indestructible, we are not." 2 weeks earlier, the unit's last operational section had encountered Thunderbolts over the Goes, Rhine. Lieutenant Karl Richter, the youngest pilot, barely 19, had engaged one in a desperate attempt to defend a column retreating toward Cologne. His cannon shells struck the Americans squarely in the engine cowling. He saw smoke, flame, even pieces of the propeller fly off, and still, impossibly, the Thunderbolt climbed away. Moments later, tracer lines streaked past him from another P-47 diving out of the sun. His own machine burst apart before he could bail out. The survivors never found his body. For the Germans who watched from the ground, that brief dogfight seemed to encapsulate the war's cruel mathematics. Courage and skill meant nothing against a machine that refused to die. Across the lines, in the mud of advanced airfields near Liège and Maastricht, American pilots readied their Thunderbolts for missions that now resembled industrial work more than combat. Rail yards, bridges, fuel convoys, each target marked by reconnaissance, struck and then struck again. The P-47 had become not just a fighter, but an airborne factory tool, hammering away at the last fragments of German resistance. Lieutenant Arthur Tex Daniels of the 399th Fighter Squadron described the feeling in his diary. "You don't fly a jug, you drive it like a bulldozer through the sky. It shakes, it growls, it leaks oil all the time, but it will get you home. She's ugly, sure, but she's ours, and she's winning the war one truck at a time." The Germans knew it, too. By that winter, captured Luftwaffe officers being interrogated at Allied camps all said the same thing. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter-bomber of the war. Its guns never jam, its armor is insane, and it never breaks. One former staff officer from the General Quartiermeister's branch confessed, "We could not stop it. Even the Flak batteries began to lose faith. They said, 'Why fire? The bullets only make it angry.'" At the shattered Rechlin test, Center, once the pride of German aviation, snow blew through the gaps where the roof had been. The hangars that once held prototypes and captured enemy aircraft were empty, except for a single forgotten hulk beneath a tattered canvas, the same Thunderbolt that had been captured near Kretville nearly a year before. Its tires were flat, its wings pitted with corrosion, but its frame still stood unbent. When Soviet troops arrived in April, they found it there, oddly intact amid wreckage. One Red Army soldier climbed into the cockpit and laughed in disbelief. "Even their airplanes survived the war," he said. As winter turned to spring, the Thunderbolts roamed the skies unchallenged. They strafed anything that moved: trains, tanks, even horse-drawn carts. Entire divisions were pinned down by a handful of these aircraft, unable to move by day. The Germans called it Jabofieber, fighter-bomber fever, a nervous sickness that spread through the troops whenever they heard the deep growl of approaching engines. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, hurricanes, and even Sturmovix, without fear, now threw themselves into ditches at the first whisper of an American radial engine. When the war finally ended in May, the last Luftwaffe pilots surrendered their sidearms and their logbooks to Allied officers. Among the seized documents was a final intelligence summary from the Reich Air Ministry, dated March 1945. It contained one short, fatal line. The Republic P-47 is a perfect weapon for an industrial nation. Against such an enemy, tactical skill is meaningless. That was the eulogy of the Luftwaffe. The sound that once mocked them, the heavy, relentless rumble of the Thunderbolt, had become the requiem of a dying air force. For 2 years, German pilots had laughed at its bulk, cursed its firepower, and feared its durability. Now, as the victors flew home over a defeated continent, the legend was complete. The flying barn door had outlasted the Eagles. The war in Europe ended as it had been fought, under the shadow of the Thunderbolt. In the first week of May, 1945, the guns fell silent across the battered continent. The great cities, Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, lay in smouldering ruins. Roads were filled with refugees moving west, seeking safety from the Red Army's vengeance. And over the ruins, the last formations of Republic P-47s thundered eastward, their missions now reduced to reconnaissance and mercy drops. At a captured Luftwaffe base near Augsburg, an American ground convoy rolled in to take possession of the airfield. The German guards had surrendered the previous day without a fight. On the far side of the cracked runway stood the relics of a lost war, wrecked Messerschmitts, twisted Focke-Wulfs, and in one corner of a hangar, something far stranger, a battered P-47 Thunderbolt, in faded olive drab, its wings riddled with holes and its canopy half melted by fire. Captain Harold Hal Morton of the 42nd Tactical Air Command was among the first inside. He ran his hand across the cowling and frowned. "That's one of ours," he said softly. "But this bird's been here a while." The markings were barely visible beneath grime, but the serial number was legible. Records confirmed it. The same aircraft forced down in the beet fields near Kretville a year before, the one the Luftwaffe had recovered and flown at Rechlin, the same machine that had refused to die. American engineers, now cataloguing enemy research, found it surrounded by German notebooks, measurements, diagrams, and meticulous notes written in faded Gothic script. They described test flights, power curves, gunnery trials, and structural analyses. The conclusion, written in a neat hand across the final page, read, "Dieses Flugzeug ist der Beweis amerikanischer Überlegenheit. Seine Stärke liegt nicht im Design, sondern in der Fertigungskraft." Translation: This aircraft is the proof of American superiority. Its strength lies not in design, but in industrial power. Morton stood in silence for a long time, reading those words. Around him, the hangar still smelled of burned fuel and despair. German technicians, now prisoners, sat on the floor smoking in silence, watching the Americans inspect their prize. One of them, a thin man in his 50s wearing a grease-stained mechanic's jacket, finally spoke in broken English. "It would not die," he said, pointing at the P-47. "We shot it, we burned it, we starved it, and it would not die." Morton nodded. "Neither would we," he replied quietly. Over the following weeks, as occupation authorities moved in and the disarmed Luftwaffe melted into history, fragments of truth emerged from interrogation reports and captured documents. German pilots spoke openly now, without propaganda, without pretense. Many admitted that by late 1944 they no longer feared the P-51 Mustang, fast though it was. They feared the P-47. It could not be escaped, one veteran of Jagdgeschwader 26 told Allied interrogators. You could outturn it, yes, but it would climb after you, dive after you, and when it fired, the air itself turned solid. We joked it was like flying into a wall of iron. Only later did we stop laughing. In the same month, the Allied technical intelligence teams shipped the captured Thunderbolt from Augsburg back to England for study. They wanted to see what the enemy had learned about their own machine. Inside the fuselage, they found German labels neatly attached to every major component. Triebwerk, ausgezeichnet, engine, excellent, Kühlung, bemerkenswert stable, cooling, remarkably stable, Struktur, übermäßig stark, structure, excessively strong. The final tag, fixed to the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, read simply, Unzerstörbar. When the aircraft was finally lifted by crane onto a flatbed truck, even the German laborers paused to watch. For them, it was like seeing a ghost. That same plane had been their teacher, a lesson in what industrial democracy could build when guided by will rather than ideology. Months later, at the Nuremberg trials, several former Luftwaffe generals gave testimony about Germany's defeat. Among the more technical discussions, fuel shortages, pilot attrition, radar failures, one comment from General Galland stood out. "The Thunderbolt," he said, "represented a philosophy we could not match. It was not elegant, but it was inevitable. It did not rely on the genius of a single engineer, but on the strength of a nation's factories. Against that, our skill meant nothing." In the autumn of 1945, the captured Thunderbolt arrived at Wright Field in Ohio. It bore its scars proudly, patched with fragments of German aluminum. A small stenciled message, left by an unknown American crewman before the war's end, still adorned the fuselage. "The joke's on you, Jerry. Technicians restored the machine for testing, but it never flew again. It was too old, too battered, too full of ghosts. Instead, it stood as a relic, an artifact of the moment when laughter turned to fear and mockery to respect." Years later, in reunions between former enemies, the memory of that captured P-47 resurfaced often. A few German pilots even visited the United States to see one again gleaming, restored, and impossibly alive. They stood beneath its massive wings, touched its skin, and shook their heads. "We called it the flying barn door," one said softly. But when it came, it closed the door on us forever. And in that simple, solemn truth, the laughter of 1943 finally silenced the story of the Thunderbolt, found its perfect ending. The hangar was silent except for the echo of footsteps and the soft hum of overhead lights. Outside, the autumn wind swept across the runways of Wright-Patterson Air Base, carrying the smell of jet fuel from the new generation of aircraft parked in formation, sleek, silver-winged F-80 and F-86 fighters. The dawn of the jet age. Yet, in Hangar 12, beneath dust and quiet reverence, stood a relic of a different era. A Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, scarred, patched, and monumental. Its olive-drab paint had faded to a dull bronze green. The armor plate bore hundreds of impact craters like constellations frozen in steel. On its nose, faint but still legible, were the words, "Big Annie from Jersey." The men who had restored her after the war had kept those markings, though no one remembered who Annie was or if she had survived. On this October afternoon, a small group gathered before the old fighter. American engineers, a handful of Air Force historians, and 2 visiting officers from the newly formed West German Air Force. One of them, Colonel Dieter Albrecht, had been a Luftwaffe pilot in 1944, flying Focke-Wulfs over Normandy. He was here to discuss joint training programs, but when he saw the Thunderbolt, he stopped walking. His breath caught. "That plane," he said softly. "We thought it was a myth." The American colonel escorting him smiled faintly. "This one's no myth, Colonel. Captured near Cratered, April 1944. Recovered after the war from Augsburg. She's tougher than she looks." Albrecht stepped closer, his gloved hand hovering just above the fuselage. He could see the welded seams, the patched bullet holes, the thick armor plate. "We shot one down, or thought we did," he said. "It fell through the clouds trailing smoke, spinning like a falling barn. When we reached the crash site, it was still in one piece. The pilot was alive. That was the first time I saw fear in my commander's face." The American nodded. "She could take punishment," he said. "Rugged design, double the skin thickness, of most. Fighters, air-cooled engine, redundant controls. She could fly with half her cylinders gone. Albrecht smiled grimly. We learned that the hard way. The conversation drifted into silence. Around them, the young engineers listened, taking notes for the historical record. The colonel's words would be filed alongside reports from Rechlin, Allied intelligence summaries, and post-war interrogations, part of a story already fading from public memory. But for those who had lived it, the Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a statement of national character forged in aluminum. That night, Albrecht sat in the base guest quarters, writing in a small leather notebook he had carried since the war. His entry for that day read, October the 12th, 1949, saw the American Thunderbolt again today. Time has changed everything. Nations, uniforms, even the sky, but not that airplane. It looks indestructible because it was built by a country that believed it was. We fought with pride, but pride cannot replace steel, oil, or numbers. We learned that truth through this machine. Meanwhile, the Air Force historians prepared their final report. They compared the Thunderbolt's durability to that of modern aircraft, noting that few new jet fighters could sustain even a fraction of the punishment that the old Republic design had endured. One engineer, Lieutenant Raymond Keane, wrote in his margin notes, "Jet engines give speed, not survivability. The P-47 was built to endure. It's the last of its kind." A few days later, technicians moved Big Annie to the base museum for permanent display. Before sealing the cockpit, Keane placed a single, folded document inside a copy of the German test report recovered at Augsburg. Its final line, in faded ink, read, "Unzerstörbar." When the canopy closed with a metallic click, the echo seemed to linger, a ghost of the thunder that once rolled across Europe. Over the following years, the Krom's Thunderbolt's legend spread quietly through flight schools, veterans' halls, and air shows. Younger pilots, flying jets at 600 miles per hour, laughed at the old stories of the Jug. They called it obsolete, a flying anvil, a brute. Yet when they read the combat records, Thunderbolts limping home with engines shot out, wings torn, even propellers missing blades, they stopped laughing. The war stories sounded exaggerated until they saw the photographs. Then they realized they were reading history written in steel. By 1951, as the Korean War raged and the Air Force searched for a reliable ground attack platform, old names began to reappear in discussions. General Curtis LeMay, reviewing potential aircraft for close air support, pointed to the files. "The Thunderbolt was built for this kind of war," he said. "We need something that can take punishment, not just fly fast." Though the jets would eventually dominate, the spirit of the P-47 lived on in doctrine, in engineering philosophy, and in the hearts of those who believed that strength mattered as much as speed. In later years, when the A-10 Thunderbolt II was unveiled, its brutal lines and heavy gun evoking another age, veterans of the 9th Air Force wept quietly at the ceremony. They called it the grandson of the Jug. On the side of the prototype, a mechanic painted a phrase taken from that German report, "Unzerstörbar." On a spring morning decades later, in a hangar filled with aircraft that once ruled the sky, sunlight caught the curved wing of the old Republic Thunderbolt at Wright-Patterson. The metal glowed gold for a moment, like the dawn over Normandy long ago. Visitors paused beneath its massive frame, reading the plaque. Republic P-47D Thunderbolt Cratered, April 1944. Damaged in combat, captured by the Luftwaffe. Survived the war, restored, 1949. No one could hear the sound anymore, the test, deep, rolling growl that once shook the fields of Europe, but the silence carried its own kind of thunder. And for those who knew the story, that silence spoke louder than any engine ever could.